Hello there, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the Splatter brush pack for Corel Painter 2016. This is a really great pack that creates splatter effects like paint splatters, ink splatters, and watercolor splatters. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first brush in the splatter pack, and that is the Color Blob brush. Now the Color Blob brush does as it says, it creates blobs of color. So what I'm doing here is I'm just tapping with my pen quickly to create little blobs. If I tap and hold, it'll spread the blob out and make it bigger. I can also draw with the brush. I can create little drips by painting downwards quickly. And you'll see there's a little bit of color variability in here. If you don't like this color variability or you want to modify it, you can look in the color variability panel. And we can see that hue is set to 50%, which means that it's going to change the color each time I paint a stroke. If I reduce that down to 0, then I'm not going to get any color variability. If I set it somewhere in the middle, then I'll get half as much. And what it's going to do here is it's going to move the hue slider a certain amount. So if I have it set to 50, this hue slider is going to move all around the ring. If I only set it to 25 or somewhere in the middle, it's only going to move a little bit. And if I set it really low, let's say to 10, it might only move towards purple and towards blue a little bit, as you can see here. Now you can also vary the saturation and the value if you like. If I turn the value all the way up, you'll see that now I'm getting lighter and darker blues as well. So you can feel free to experiment with this if you like. If you want to reset a brush, all you have to do is click up here in the top left on Reset Tool. That'll put it back to its default setting. I'm going to go ahead and just clear this out. And let's take a look at one other feature here, and that is the size of the brush. If I make my brush really, really big, I'm holding Control and Alt and dragging my pen, then these color drops start to look more like splats. So if you want this drop effect, you'll want to be using a smaller brush. Let's take a look at the next brush, and that is the Color Clump. I'm going to draw a test stroke, and you can see it has all kinds of color variability. You get this really wild, clumpy color effect. You can also make a really big brush, and you can tap quickly to create little splatters across your canvas. You can tap and hold to create a really big splatter. And again, if you look in the color variability, you can reduce or increase the color variability if you want more or less variability. Moving on to the next brush, we have Color Splat. We can use a small brush to create little splats, or we can use a medium brush to create larger splats, but you can see that paint really splatters out as if you were throwing paint against a canvas really hard in real life. If we use a really big brush, we can get a huge splat. I just did one quick tap. The longer you tap and hold, the more paint you're going to put down. It's going to work a little slowly. If you're using a big canvas and a really big brush, you can see that it's still going while I'm talking here. That's because this brush is really doing a whole lot. It's throwing a lot of paint out the longer you hold the pen down. Next, we'll take a look at one of my favorite brushes in this set, and this is the drip brush. And people are always asking me, how do I get a paint drip effect? Well, this is a good way to do it. So I'm going to select a color. Maybe we'll choose this hot pink color. And the trick with this brush is just to paint straight down. And the quicker you paint, the more drippy the paint is. The slower you paint, the thicker it is. You can also vary your pen pressure if you want it to kind of taper off. There's kind of a perfect speed to use here, somewhere between quick and slow. And you get something like this. And as with all these brushes, the size of your brush really makes a difference. You might get a different effect if you use a bigger brush. If I use a bigger brush and I just tap and hold in one spot, without moving my brush up or down, you can see that I'm getting these drips that kind of flow down on their own too. So you could just go through and just tap like this and put little drips. Or you could use a smaller brush and you could have a drip that kind of travels and forks off like this just by doing multiple strokes. Or you could have a really wide drip like this by painting side to side and then adding a few drips that come down off of that. This is a really great paint drip effect. You can also control the elevation of the paint off of the surface of the canvas to make it look more three-dimensional. To get to that option, you want to double click next to the liquid ink layer in the layers palette. That'll bring up the liquid ink layer attributes. You can increase the amount, let's say to 433, and we'll click OK. And now you can see that if we zoom in, there's a little bit of three-dimensionality to this ink. It's not just flat. Let's try this with some other colors here. Let's put down some red And now it stands out a bit more. Now you can adjust this on the fly. You can always double click again next to the liquid ink layer. You can reduce the amount. Let's put it a little bit lower, like at 91. And if we zoom in, you can see it looks thick, but it's not elevated quite as much. Now this works for all the liquid ink brushes, so I can even use it on this color splat brush. I'll go ahead and add a little bit of an amount here. And you can see that it makes the ink look elevated up off of the canvas and much thicker. Let's take a look at the next brush, and that is Fat Mosaic. And Fat Mosaic works well for creating some mosaic type effects. So you can see there's all these little mosaic patterns in here. And if you use a smaller brush, you get kind of a smaller, finer spray. If you use a bigger brush, you get a bigger spray that kind of fans out. Again, you can control the color variability here. I can turn down the R, G, and the B for the red, green, and the blue. And now I'm getting much less variability. If I turn that back up, then it's going to start to vary more. The smoothness setting also controls how that color variability is distributed. So if I turn the smoothness up, you can see between the two strokes, when the smoothness was lower, there were small little patches where the color varied, versus when I turn the smoothness up, there's bigger, broader, longer gradient transitions between the colors. So that's something you can experiment with too. And again, if I want to reset this brush, I'll just click on Reset Tool and that puts it back to its default. Moving on to the next brush, we have Fine Spray. This is a very versatile brush and you can get a lot of different effects depending on the type of stroke that you make. So I'm going to use a really small brush and I'm going to draw a stroke. You can see that it responds to your pen pressure, so you can kind of taper it off. If I make a bigger brush, I can kind of tap and make splatters like so. Quick splatters will give you more sparse paint. If you tap and hold longer, you get bigger, thicker splatters. If you make a really big brush and you press down really hard, you'll get a really big, really wild splatter. And so you can kind of combine these effects if you want to, and really just build this up into a nice organic looking splatter very easily. Next on the list is Spatter, and this gives you little tiny paint spatters like so. I'm using kind of a bigger brush, so it's going to make bigger spatters that spread out more. But if I make my brush smaller, I can make individual little blobs. If I make a really big brush, that's going to spread them out more. Now, if you want a little more control over any of these brushes, you can always look in your advanced brush controls. I'm going to click up here on the ABC icon, and that'll show me all of the relevant options for this brush. So let's say, for instance, I wanted there to be less splatters. I can reduce the count, and I'll get fewer spatters, or I can increase the count, and I'll get many more. This is a liquid ink brush, and we know that it's a liquid ink brush because when we paint with it, we get a liquid ink layer. So if we look under the liquid ink properties, we can also play with the volume, minimum volume, smoothness, and all these settings to get some different effects. So I'm going to reduce the volume to 1, and the minimum volume to 1 as well. And I'm going to reduce the thickness to 10%. So these are going to be thinner blobs that have less ink in them. Now if I tap, you can see I'm getting these really fine little spatters. You almost can't see most of them. If I do the reverse and I increase the thickness and I increase the volume and I tap, you can see that I'm getting these huge spatters now. I'm going to go ahead and reset this brush to its original setting, and now it's back to its default. It's worth mentioning that you can combine a lot of these brushes too. For instance, I put my spatter down. Now if I wanted to go back to my drip and add a few drips, I could do that too. I can make a few of these drip down. It's worth mentioning that there's a variety of brushes in here, so the liquid ink brushes are going to work really well with each other. But if I tried to use something like, let's say, a blender on top of this liquid ink layer, it's not going to work because liquid ink, while it's liquid ink, is still wet and it can only be added to with other liquid ink brushes. So when I tried to blend, it created a new layer for me. If I want to actually blend that liquid ink layer, what I need to do is right click on that layer and choose Convert to Default Layer. It's no longer wet liquid ink, so it's not going to interact with the liquid ink brushes, but now you could blend it if you wanted to. So maybe a good analogy for this would be drying the liquid ink so it's no longer wet, and that's what happens when you convert to a default layer. After Spatter, we have Spongy, and Spongy gives you a nice natural media sponge effect. I'm just going to tap with this. You can see I can create this nice brown texture here. Using a medium-sized brush, the clumps kind of converge or stick together. But if you make a bigger brush, they spread out a little bit more and they get smaller. If you use a tiny brush, then you could actually just paint with this or make little blobs if you wanted to. I'm going to stick with a medium brush here, and you can see that I can really easily build up a nice organic looking sponge texture. Next on the list is Streaky. Streaky gives you some pretty interesting dynamic looking strokes here. This and many of the other brushes are connected to particle technology, and you can see that these little particles move and dance around. If I paint a really slow stroke, even if I'm painting it relatively straight, the brush stroke comes out wobbly because it's more organic or more random because of the particles. If I move my brush more quickly, those particles have less time to move about, but you still get a little variability in the stroke. If you don't like that this brush changes colors, you can always turn off the color variability, like so. Then you'll just get one single flat color. If you use a really big brush, you're going to see more of a gap between each of these particles. And if you use a smaller, thinner brush, that gap won't be as apparent. Underneath Streaky, we have Thin Mosaic. Thin Mosaic is very similar to Fat Mosaic, except it's a bit finer. So I'll just put them next to each other, and you can see that thin is on the left, fat is on the right. So the mosaic pattern's a little bit smaller. Below Thin Mosaic, we have Water Splat, and Water Splat's one of my favorites in this set. You just simply tap and it creates little splats. Now you have to kind of tap and hold sometimes if you want a thicker splat, because if you just tap quickly, what you get might be a little too sparse. So if you want kind of a thin splat, just tap quickly. If you want a thicker splat, tap and hold for a second. You can see you get these really nice watercolor effects here. Now this is a watercolor layer type, so just like with the liquid ink layer, if you wanted to be able to blend this, you would have to convert it first to a default layer. So I'm going to right click on it, convert it to a default layer, and then now I can blend this if I want to. And again, just think of convert to default layer as drying the paint so that it's no longer wet. But if we keep this as a watercolor layer, we can get some nice watercolor effects. For example, I could take a couple different colors and layer them on each other like this, and they all kind of bleed and blend together. Now I should mention that some of these brushes don't have color variability by default, but that doesn't mean that you can't add it to most of them. If I look down in color variability, I can add color variability to this. You see it changes the color a little bit. Or if I just want it to be maybe a little bit darker, I can just increase the value. Now this is kind of putting little chunks of color within the same blob, but if I increase the smoothness here and I increase the value, I'm going to get some blobs that are light and some blobs that are dark. Rather than if I decrease the smoothness, I'm getting the light and dark within the same blob. So two different effects. Underneath Water Splat, we have Wet Sponge. Wet Sponge is also a watercolor brush, and it creates these little particle speckles. So I can just paint with it like so. Or I can tap just to make little blobs. But it's a nice splattery, blobby effect. I like this a lot. Again, you could combine this with the Water Splat brush if you wanted to. It gives you some nice organic looking results. If I make my brush smaller, I get finer little drips. If I make my brush bigger, I get bigger blobs. If I make it really big, I'll get these giant blobs. Because this is watercolor, you'll notice that it takes a minute to kind of soak into the paper, so I just give it time to do its thing. Moving on, we have Wide Splat. Wide Splat works really well to give you a big, broad splat without the splatter particles moving too far away. So this could be a big, thick splat of paint, and then if you wanted to kind of build off of that, you could just kind of tap like so. This could be maybe the center of your splat, and then if you wanted to build off of that, let's say with some drips, like so, you could do that. You could pull out some little streaks here if you want it to kind of splatter out a bit more. You could even go to the spatter brush, and you could add a few little spatters here. And by combining all these brushes, you can get some really organic looking effects. If you use a pretty big brush, Wild Splat's going to spread out a bit more. If you use a smaller brush, it's going to stay a little more confined. Next on the list is Wild Flow. Wild Flow is a really interesting watercolor type brush. You can see that the paint is kind of flowing into a particular pattern. That's because this brush uses the flow map. So if we look at the flow maps panel, you can see right now it's working with horizontal flow, but I could try some other flow maps, for instance, find dots, and then it'll flow a bit differently into that pattern. Or if we try this hot lava, you can see that it's yet a different pattern. If we look at the advanced brush controls, you can also play with all the watercolor settings, or we could go to the flow particles and you could play with the way that the particles move around within the flow map. You can also change the scale of the flow map if you want it to be finer. You can rotate the flow map, and you can play with the contrast and brightness of the flow map. So it's all stuff that's worth experimenting with. If you're not feeling that adventurous, then the default settings work just fine too. And the final brush that we'll look at is Wild Splat. And Wild Splat does as it says, it creates a pretty wild splat. I'm going to tap and you can see that there's these really chaotic looking splats where there's a lot going on. So maybe somebody's throwing paint at a canvas really hard. I'm using kind of a smaller brush and tapping really firmly, really quickly. You can also make a bigger brush and that'll kind of scatter the paint further. If you don't like this soft blending effect within your paint and you want to layer your paint, let's say I want to put this black on top of the pink, but I don't want it to fade together like that. What you can do is rather than work on the same liquid ink layer, you can create a new layer and then paint. And what that's going to do is that's going to put a second liquid ink layer on your canvas. So now these are actually separate from each other. And I get a little more control and I don't have that blending. And you could just delete this extra blank layer here. That's just used to kind of separate them from each other. If you wanted to do that again, just create another new layer, select a different color, and then add in your splatters like so. And you can kind of build it up. And at the end, if you wanted to blend all this together, you could select all these layers and you could collapse them into a single layer, which is going to merge them together and it's going to convert them to a default layer. And then you could go through with your blender and you could blend this together like so. So there you go. That's a quick demonstration of the brushes in the splatter pack for Corel Painter 2016. If you enjoyed this video, take a quick second to click the like button. And if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe to get more Corel Painter tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.